Picture this. You're standing in one of the most magnificent halls in medieval France. The year is 1377. After Christ, and the great hall of Carcassonne stretches before you like a cathedral of war. Massive stone pillars support vaulted ceilings that have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. Tapestries depicting glorious battles line the walls, their golden threads catching the flickering light of 100 torches. And there, in the centre of this architectural marvel, stands a man about to be laughed out of the room, Sir Roland de Martel. Remember that name, because you're about to witness one of history's most spectacular vindications. But right now, surrounded by 300 of France's most powerful knights, Roland looks like he's about to propose the architectural equivalent of a perpetual motion machine. You see, Roland has just unveiled his revolutionary castle design to an audience that considers tradition as sacred as the Holy Grail itself. We're talking about men who believe that if square towers were good enough for Charlemagne, they're good enough for eternity. These are knights who've inherited castles built on foundations laid by their great-great-grandfathers, men who see innovation as a personal insult to their ancestors' intelligence. And what exactly is Roland proposing? A circular tower, with slanted walls. In an era when military architecture follows patterns as rigid as cathedral construction, this is like suggesting that horses should fly or that peasants should vote. The laughter begins as a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then it builds. 300 voices in various stages of amusement, from polite chuckles to outright guffaws. Some knights actually point. Others shake their heads with the kind of pity usually reserved for village idiots. The sound echoes off those ancient stones, bouncing around the hall like a physical thing, pressing down on Roland from all sides. But here's what those laughing knights don't know. What they can't possibly understand from their cushioned seats and inherited wisdom. Roland de Martel has survived 23 sieges, not observed them from a safe distance, not heard about them second-hand, survived them. He's watched stone towers that stood for centuries crumble like children's blocks when faced with the new reality of warfare. Think about that for a moment. 23 times, this man has stood on castle walls, while enemy artillery tried to murder him. 23 times, he's seen the best military engineering that medieval Europe could produce, tested by siege engines that our ancestors would have considered miraculous. And 23 times, he's learned something that these laughing lords refuse to accept. The world has changed. The most devastating lesson came at Château Montluc. Roland's own brother, Sir Guillaume, was commanding the defence. The castle had stood unconquered for 200 years. Its walls were 30 feet thick. Its towers rose like stone mountains against the sky. Guillaume was confident, experienced, beloved by his men. The siege began on a Tuesday morning in spring. By the following Monday, Guillaume was dead, crushed under tons of stone when the northeast tower collapsed. The castle that had defied armies for 2 centuries fell in 6 days. 6 days. You want to understand the scale of this transformation? Imagine if someone told you that aircraft carriers were now vulnerable to fishing boats. That's the level of revolution we're talking about. Everything that military engineers thought they knew about defensive architecture had become not just obsolete, but actively dangerous. Roland's design represents more than architectural innovation. It's a mathematical rebellion against tradition. The circular shape eliminates blind spots that have plagued castle defenders since fortifications were invented. Every point on the perimeter can be observed and defended from multiple angles. No hidden approaches. No safe zones for attackers to mass their forces. But the real genius lies in those slanted walls that are making the Knights of Carcassonne laugh so hard. When a projectile hits a vertical surface, all that kinetic energy transfers directly into the stone. It's like hitting a brick wall with a sledgehammer. Something's going to break, and it's usually the wall. But when that same projectile hits a slanted surface, physics takes over. The energy redirects. Instead of shattering stone, cannonballs and catapult stones slide away like raindrops on a window. Roland isn't just proposing better defences, he's offering better economics. His design cuts building costs by 30%, while tripling defensive strength. In an age when a single castle can bankrupt a noble family, this matters more than pride or tradition. But try explaining economics to men who measure wealth in ancestral glory rather than actual gold. Duke Philippe de Montmorency, Roland's liege lord, rises from his carved throne. The hall falls silent with the kind of instant quiet that absolute power commands. Philippe's family has ruled this region since the time of the Crusades. His great-grandfather built castles, his grandfather built castles, his father built castles. All of them square, traditional, and now, Roland suggests, obsolete. Sir Roland, the Duke's voice carries the chill of winter mountains. Your proposal is an insult to God's own geometry. The Almighty created the square as perfection's symbol. Who are we to improve upon divine design? It's a theological argument wrapped in military necessity, the kind of logic that has kept Europe locked in patterns for centuries. But Roland has mathematics on his side, and mathematics, as it turns out, doesn't care about tradition. Your Grace, Roland responds, his voice cutting through the hall's tension like a blade through silk. Your last castle cost 8,000 gold pieces and fell in 3 weeks. My tower will cost 5,000 and stand forever. Forever. In a room full of men who've watched their fathers' fortresses crumble, that word hangs in the air like incense. Because Roland isn't just promising better defences, he's promising immortality in stone. The silence stretches. 300 knights, the flower of French nobility, sit frozen between laughter and possibility, and in that moment of hesitation, in that heartbeat of doubt, the future begins to crack open. Master mason Pierre Dubois has built 17 cathedrals. His hands have shaped stone that will outlast kingdoms. His techniques have been passed down through 4 generations of the finest builders in France. And when Sir Roland de Martel approaches him with drawings of curved walls and slanted foundations, Pierre's first response is as predictable as sunrise. Absolutely not. Curves are for churches, not fortresses, Pierre declares, his weathered fingers tracing the parchment like he's trying to understand a foreign language. God's house deserves beauty. Man's house needs strength. These are different things, Sir Roland. But Pierre Dubois didn't become a master mason by being inflexible. He's seen enough stonework to recognize genius when mathematics proves it. So when Roland leads him to the practice field behind Carcassonne and demonstrates something that will change both their lives forever, Pierre's world shifts on its foundation. Roland has constructed 2 wall sections, one traditional and vertical, one slanted at the angle his design demands. Both are built from identical stone, identical mortar, identical craftsmanship. The only difference is geometry. Roland's demonstration uses a trebuchet, not the massive siege engines that would face a real castle, but one powerful enough to prove his point. The first shot strikes the vertical wall dead center. Stone explodes. Fragments shower the ground like deadly rain. The impact crater extends nearly 2 feet into the wall's thickness. 3 more shots and the entire section collapses in a thunderous cascade of rubble. Now watch the slanted wall. The projectile hits with identical force, identical stone quality, identical everything except angle. But instead of shattering, it deflects. The stone slides along the angled surface and bounces away, leaving barely a scratch. Shot after shot produces the same result. Deflection instead of destruction. Pierre stares at those unmarked stones like he's witnessing a miracle, because in his world of right angles and traditional methods, he essentially is. Mother of God, he whispers, and you can hear 40 years of certainty cracking in his voice. It actually works. Within a week, Pierre has recruited his crew. These aren't ordinary workers. They're artisans who've shaped stone for palaces and cathedrals, men whose reputations depend on perfection. But curves present challenges that straight lines never imagined. How do you cut stone for a wall that follows a circle? How do you maintain consistent angles when every piece must be unique? Enter Jean de Toulouse, barely 18 years old, and officially the lowest apprentice in Pierre's hierarchy. While master craftsmen struggle with the mathematics of circles, Jean starts experimenting with bent wood. He creates templates, flexible guides that can wrap around the tower's curve and mark cutting lines on each stone. It's ingenious in its simplicity, using the flexibility of wood to create the rigidity of stone. The other apprentices mock him at first. They call his wooden guides Jean's toys and predict disaster. But when Jean's stones fit together like pieces of a perfect puzzle while theirs require constant adjustment, the mockery dies. Within a month, every worker on the project is using Jean's template system. The construction site becomes the most popular entertainment in the region. Merchants detour from established trade routes just to gawk at the impossible tower rising stone by stone. Some arrive expecting to witness a spectacular collapse. Others come hoping to understand what they're seeing. All leave confused, because this architectural revolution challenges everything they thought they knew about building. The local priests present their own complications. Father Benedict, whose sermons have guided Carcassonne's spiritual life for 20 years, denounces the project from his pulpit every Sunday. God made the square as perfection's symbol, he thunders to congregations who nod in automatic agreement. This tower mocks divine geometry. It invites God's wrath upon our heads. But some knights begin asking different questions, quiet questions. Questions about costs and construction time and defensive advantages. Sir Gaston de Beaumont, whose own castle needs expensive repairs, corners Roland after Sunday Mass. This design of yours, truly 30% less expensive? The conversation lasts 2 hours, and ends with Gaston commissioning detailed drawings. The kitchen maid Agnes emerges as an unexpected leader during this period. She organizes the workers' wives into something resembling a support network, but it becomes much more. These women, who understand hardship in ways their noble employers never could, recognize something revolutionary in Roland's approach. Agnes composes songs about the tower that bends but never breaks, and soon those melodies echo across construction sites throughout the region. Marie de Martel, Roland's wife, takes a completely practical approach to the whole affair. While her husband designs revolutionary fortifications, she plans for the revolution's aftermath. Her herb garden within the future courtyard isn't decorative, it's strategic. These plants will provide medicine during siege conditions, when outside help becomes impossible. Marie thinks in terms of sustainability, of survival, of the human cost that military architects often ignore. Their children adapt with the flexibility that only young minds possess. They practice archery against the curved interior walls, learning angles that square towers could never teach. Little Philippe, barely 10 years old, discovers that arrows ricochet differently off curved surfaces, opening tactical possibilities that centuries of traditional training never explored. But the tower's water system truly amazes everyone who sees it. Roland has designed cisterns carved directly into the bedrock, channels that collect rain from the conical roof, storage capacity calculated for 500 days of siege conditions. It's engineering on a scale that transforms defensive architecture from reactive to proactive. By 1382, as harvest festivals celebrate the tower's completion, Roland's foolish experiment stands 40 feet high, its curved walls rising like a stone thumb against the sky. The construction cost exactly what Roland promised: 5,000 gold pieces, 30% less than traditional designs. The building time was 18 months, half what comparable fortifications required. But completion brings its own dangers. Lord Gautier de Malvoisin, one of the original mockers from that day in Carcassonne's Great Hall, arrives with 2,000 men and 30 siege engines. His message to Roland is simple: let's test your theory. Gautier's confidence stems from experience. He's reduced 7 castles in 3 years of constant warfare. His siege engineers trained in England's brutal campaigns. His artillery includes equipment captured from defeated enemies across France. When he surveys Roland's curved tower, he sees not innovation but arrogance that needs correction. The first bombardment begins at dawn on a crisp October morning. 30 siege engines launch simultaneously, filling the air with stone projectiles the size of wine barrels. The sound alone would terrify most defenders, a thunderous roar like the world ending. But Roland's mathematics prove themselves under fire. Stones, that would shatter traditional walls, slide off those curves like hail off a cathedral dome. Gautier's master engineer, a grizzled veteran named Thomas Blackwood who learned his trade during the Scottish Wars, admits something he's never said before. "I've never seen anything like this." The psychological impact on Gautier's forces becomes apparent within days. Siege ladders, constructed for vertical walls, slip and fall against the outward slope. Grappling hooks find no purchase on smooth, angled surfaces. Traditional siege tactics, refined through centuries of warfare, simply don't work. After 6 weeks and 400 casualties without breaching the walls, Gautier retreats in complete humiliation. But his failure creates Roland's greatest danger. Every ambitious lord in France now wants to be the one who breaks the Fool's Tower. Roland's success has made him the target that every military leader needs to defeat to prove their worth. As winter arrives and Gautier's defeated army disappears over the horizon, Roland uses the quiet months for preparation. He knows the real test is coming. 5 rival lords are already meeting in secret, planning the siege that will make Gautier's effort look like a practice round. The year 1384 brings apocalypse to Roland's doorstep. This isn't Gautier's amateur hour anymore. This is warfare elevated to a level that would impress Roman legions. 5 lords have united their forces into a coalition that represents the largest military concentration in France outside of royal armies. 15,000 men, 50 siege engines, and 3 massive trebuchets that their crews have named with the casual blasphemy of professional killers: Widowmaker, Stonecrusher, and God's Hammer. Think about those numbers for a moment. 15,000 men represents roughly the population of a major medieval city. These aren't part-time soldiers or hastily recruited peasants. This coalition includes Italian engineers who learned their trade reducing Byzantine fortifications, English artillery specialists fresh from devastating Scottish castles, and even Byzantine Greeks carrying the secret of Greek fire, that medieval napalm that burns on water and terrifies everyone who faces it. Lord Gautier returns for revenge, but he's no longer the main player. The Count of Armagnac leads this expedition, a man whose family has crushed rebellions for 3 generations. The Duke of Bourbon brings financing that could fund a small war, which, essentially, it is. 2 German princes contribute heavy cavalry and siege expertise earned in the endless conflicts that define their homeland. The siege begins in spring with continuous bombardment that transforms day and night into meaningless concepts. The thunder never stops. Imagine living inside a bell that's being struck by giant hammers every few minutes, hour after hour, week after week. The psychological warfare is as deliberate as the physical destruction. Break their minds before you break their walls. God's Hammer proves its name by launching stones that weigh as much as draft horses. When these projectiles hit Roland's slanted walls, they slide away as his mathematics predicted. But the impact still shakes the entire structure. Dust rains from the ceiling continuously. Water in storage tanks sloshes with each strike. Even deflected, the energy has to go somewhere. But the slanted walls are doing exactly what Roland designed them to do. Traditional fortifications would have crumbled within days under this assault. Roland's tower absorbs punishment that would reduce conventional castles to rubble, deflecting enough force to stay standing while taking damage that accumulates like compound interest. Summer brings disease to both camps, the medieval equalizer that kills more soldiers than enemy action ever will. Within the tower, Roland implements rationing with a radical twist. Nobles and servants receive equal portions. This democracy of hunger prevents the internal rebellions that doom most sieges, but it comes at a cost. Marie de Martel, who has never known want in her privileged life, learns to divide single onions among 8 people and call it feast. The besiegers face their own hell. 15,000 men require enormous supply lines that stretch back to their home territories. Desertion becomes epidemic as soldiers realize they've committed to a siege that could last years. Local peasants, initially cooperative, turn hostile as their crops are stripped to feed this military monster. Gautier finds himself fighting not just Roland's tower but the entire countryside. Winter arrives like a divine judgment on everyone involved. Both sides are dying now, not from enemy action but from starvation and cold. Inside the tower, defenders eat leather, rats, anything that contains substance. Marie leads the women in creating what they ironically call siege bread, a mixture of ground acorns, clay, and hope that barely qualifies as food, but keeps people alive. The children adapt with that terrible resilience that only the young possess. Too weak to stand for long periods, they still mock the enemy in whispered songs that Agnes taught them. Their voices become the tower's heartbeat, proof that defiance survives even when bodies fail. But the real war rages underground, invisible to observers but deadly as anything happening above ground. Enemy sappers tunnel toward the tower's foundations, while Roland's counterminers meet them in darkness, lit only by animal fat lamps. Men fight with knives in spaces too tight for swords, dying in earthen tombs that collapse without warning. These subterranean battles claim dozens of lives for every foot of tunnel gained or lost. Jean de Toulouse, the young apprentice who mastered curved construction, now leads these underground fighters. His intimate knowledge of the tower's foundation gives Roland's forces crucial advantages, but the psychological toll is devastating. Jean emerges from tunnels covered in clay and blood, looking like something that crawled from hell itself. The breaking point arrives after 15 months of mutual destruction. Food is completely gone. 38 defenders have died from disease. Greek fire has blackened the tower's crown, though the slanted walls prevented the flames from spreading as the attackers hoped. Both sides exist in a state that barely qualifies as survival. The coalition prepares their final assault. 5,000 men will storm simultaneously from all directions. It's a desperate gamble that acknowledges their inability to breach the walls through conventional siege warfare. Roland faces an impossible choice: remain inside and hope the tower's defenses can withstand direct assault, or risk everything on a desperate gamble. He chooses the gamble. With his last 40 able fighters, Roland plans a pre-dawn sortie targeting God's Hammer, the trebuchet that has done the most damage to his tower. It's suicide with a purpose. Destroy the enemy's most effective weapon, even if it costs every remaining life. The attack succeeds beyond all reasonable expectation. Moving through darkness with the stealth that only desperate men can achieve, Roland's fighters reach the trebuchet undetected. They kill the crew, destroy the counterweight mechanism, and set the entire structure ablaze. But Roland takes a crossbow bolt through his shoulder, and the wound promises complications that could prove fatal in his weakened condition. As the final assault begins with 5,000 screaming attackers rushing toward the tower's base, horns sound from the north. Clear, powerful, unmistakable, royal horns announcing the arrival of King Charles VI himself. The monarch, drawn by tales of the impossible siege that has lasted longer than most wars, arrives with royal forces sufficient to scatter any coalition. The 5 lords face a choice between certain annihilation fighting the crown or strategic retreat that preserves their armies for future campaigns. They choose survival, abandoning 18 months of investment and hundreds of casualties to avoid royal wrath. The coalition scatters like leaves before a storm, their massive siege engines left behind as monuments to failed ambition. The 18-month hell ends not with dramatic victory or crushing defeat, but with exhausted survival. Roland's tower stands, blackened and scarred but fundamentally intact. Of the 300 original defenders, 98 are dead, a casualty rate that would destroy most military units. But the survivors have proven something that will echo through military history. Proper design can overcome impossible odds. As royal physicians tend to Roland's wounds and royal supply trains bring food to the starving defenders, messengers already ride toward distant castles carrying news of the tower that would not fall. Kings and princes across Europe demand detailed reports. Military engineers begin sketching curved walls and slanted foundations. But victory's true cost lies in the faces of those who survived. Marie will never fully recover from months of starvation. Agnes has lost 2 grandchildren to disease. Jean looks like an old man at 25. They've paid in flesh and blood for Roland's vindication, and that payment will shadow every future triumph. Victory transforms everything, but not always in the ways you'd expect. The Fool's Tower becomes Europe's most studied fortification within a year of the siege's end. Kings and princes journey from Scotland to Sicily just to understand its secrets. Roland de Martel, the wounded knight who was once mocked in Carcassonne's great hall, now charges 1,000 gold pieces for consultation, more than most nobles earn in a decade. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Roland doesn't just bask in vindication. He revolutionizes defensive architecture across an entire continent. From the windswept highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked hills of Sicily, curved towers begin rising like stone flowers. Each new construction represents a complete repudiation of thousand-year-old traditions. The first commission comes from an unexpected source, King Edward III of England, whose military engineers have spent decades perfecting the art of destroying French castles. Edward wants to know how to build fortifications that English siege engines cannot breach. The irony is delicious. France's greatest military innovation being adopted by its oldest enemy. Roland's design spreads through a network of relationships that medieval society understands perfectly. Jean de Toulouse, the young apprentice who mastered curved construction, becomes a master builder in his own right. He carries Roland's techniques to the Low Countries, where merchant cities need defences against both royal armies and rival trading centres. Every castle Jean builds becomes a teaching tool for local masons who spread the knowledge further. But the human cost weighs on everyone who survived those 18 months of hell. Marie de Martel never fully recovers from the starvation that nearly killed her. She lives 3 more years, long enough to see her husband vindicated and wealthy, but her body never forgives the months of siege bread and rationed water. She dies quietly in her sleep during the winter of 1387, her last words reportedly a joke about finally having enough to eat. Roland's grief is profound but private. He throws himself into design work with an intensity that worries his friends. Within 5 years of Marie's death, he has designed over 30 castles across France, England, and the German states. Each represents not just military innovation, but a memorial to the woman who planned herb gardens while he planned walls. Agnes, the kitchen maid who kept hope alive with her songs during the siege, lives to see her. Great-grandchildren grow up in a world where curved towers are normal rather than revolutionary. The songs she composed about the tower that bends but never breaks become folk ballads that survive for centuries. Medieval historians find references to these melodies in documents from as far away as Poland and Hungary. The transformation extends beyond individual castles to entire military philosophies. Traditional siege warfare, based on concentrating force against weak points in vertical walls, becomes obsolete almost overnight. Military engineers must develop entirely new approaches to assault and defense. The art of war evolves in response to Roland's mathematics. Young Jean faces his own challenges as Roland's most successful apprentice. The underground fighting during the siege left psychological scars that never fully heal. He suffers from what we would recognize as post-traumatic stress, though medieval medicine has no name for the condition that makes him wake screaming from dreams of collapsed tunnels and burning siege engines. Yet he channels this trauma into revolutionary architecture, designing not just defensive walls but entire castle complexes that account for siege conditions from the beginning. Roland lives until 1401, designing over 60 castles during his final 2 decades. His death brings an extraordinary funeral, 10,000 mourners, including kings, master builders, and common folk, who understand that he changed the world. The funeral eulogy, delivered by King Charles himself, contains the ultimate vindication of a man once mocked as a fool. They called him fool. History calls him prophet. But perhaps the most telling measure of Roland's impact comes from an unexpected source: archaeological evidence that medieval people left behind without intending to create historical records. When modern archaeologists examine the tower's stones, they find siege graffiti carved by desperate defenders during those 18 months of hell. "Marie saves water like gold," reads one inscription. "Little Pierre killed a rat, feast tonight," declares another. "God sees even curved prayers," observes a third, suggesting that even divine communication adapted to the tower's revolutionary geometry. These fragments of human experience, preserved in stone for 6 centuries, reveal the true cost of innovation. Roland's mathematical triumph required extraordinary sacrifice from ordinary people who believed in his vision enough to die for it. Their names don't appear in official histories, but their words survive in the stones they defended. Today, 6 centuries after Roland first proposed his revolutionary design, every square tower from his era lies in ruins. Time, weather, and changing military needs have reduced those traditional fortifications to picturesque rubble that tourists photograph without understanding. But the Fool's Tower still stands. Its stones have been worn smooth by centuries of wind, rain, and pilgrims' touches. Local children play in its shadow, never knowing they're running around something their ancestors once thought impossible. The herb garden that Marie planned within the courtyard still grows, tended now by the French Ministry of Culture as a historical preservation project. The tower serves as a monument to more than military innovation. It represents the eternal conflict between tradition and progress, between the safety of accepted wisdom and the risks of revolutionary thinking. Roland de Martel stood before 300 mocking knights and bet his reputation, his fortune, and ultimately his life on mathematics that contradicted everything those men believed. He won that bet, but victory came at a price that echoes through the centuries. Every stone in that tower represents someone's sacrifice. Roland's vision, Marie's herbs, Agnes's songs, Jean's nightmares, the 38 defenders who died proving that curves could triumph over tradition. Their legacy stands not just in architectural innovation, but in the courage required to build something the world insists cannot exist. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Fool's Tower. In every generation, in every field of human endeavor, someone proposes something that contradicts accepted wisdom. Most of the time, the mockery is justified, and the innovation fails. But occasionally, just occasionally, the fool turns out to be the only one who truly understood what was possible. The children playing in the tower's shadow today don't know they're running around a miracle. They take curved walls for granted because Roland's revolution succeeded so completely that it became invisible. The ultimate tribute to any innovation, when it stops being revolutionary and becomes simply the way things are done. The last laugh, as it turns out, belongs to the Lord they mocked as fool.